So welcome back to International School History and this series of lessons looking at the rise, consolidation and rule of authoritarian states. In our last lesson we considered the underlying structural conditions which give rise to authoritarian states and in particular the importance of war. Today we're moving on to consider the methods employed by the historical actors themselves as they seek to establish authoritarian rule.
All the world's a stage. And all the men and women
merely players.
Merely players.
Merely players.
Merely players.
Merely players.
Now we can use this Shakespearean metaphor to help us make sense of the concepts of structure and agency. If the structural factors are the stage directions, the costumes and the script, then agency refers to the performance of the actors on that stage. In brief, structural factors are important, but people, real historical actors, can and do make a difference. As Marx said, history does nothing. It possesses no immense wealth, fights no battles. It is rather man, real living man, who does everything, who possesses and fights. Methods used to establish authoritarian states can be divided into three types, three categories that will be familiar from an earlier lesson. The state controls the individual through three distinct mechanisms: coercion, persuasion, and consent. Now, the first method is a coercive tendency to use violence. The second method is persuasion, notably in the use of propaganda. And the third method is to propose the sorts of changes that people are keen to support and give their consent to. Now, when an authoritarian regime comes to power through coercion, it means that force has been used against those who oppose regime change. Now, many authoritarian regimes come to power after successful revolutions or military coups d'etat. These are violent acts that require a willingness to take up arms against the power of the state. As Mao famously said, a revolution is not a dinner party or writing an essay or painting a picture or doing embroidery. It cannot be so refined, so leisurely and gentle, so temperate, kind, courteous, restrained and magnanimous. A revolution is an insurrection, an act of violence. Revolutionaries must be prepared to get their hands dirty. Now, Lenin wrote some of the most sophisticated philosophical work of the 20th century, but he also wrote articles about methods to be used when killing policemen or on how to rob banks. It's also worth noting that although coercion is employed against opponents of would-be authoritarian regimes, it is also used in revolutionary organizations to help instill discipline within the group that is attempting to seize power. It can be just as important that revolutionaries fear the consequences of betraying their cause more than being caught and punished by those in authority itself. But if the revolution is to succeed, coercion alone is rarely enough. There needs also to be some support for change. Now, persuasive methods refer to efforts made to influence public opinion, both elite and popular, in favour of the authoritarian regime. For those authoritarian states where ideology is important, notably in the case of single-party states, an extensive propaganda campaign provides essential preparation for the takeover of power. Quite often, the propaganda campaign is conducted in the context of genuine democratic elections in which the authoritarian regime garners significant levels of popular support before going on to gradually seize power. Now, this was notably the case with Nazi Germany in 1933 and the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia in 1946. Somewhat neglected, but important nonetheless, is the fact that the authoritarian regimes come to power and maintain their power on the basis of popular will. For example, a context in which personal security cannot be guaranteed or where the food supply is irregular can provide an environment in which stability and security become overwhelming priorities, rather more important than democratic elections, for example.
COVID has emboldened would-be dictators.
In Russia, during a World War II commemoration parade, police shoved protesters into vans thanks to a new measure against public assembly. Vladimir Putin won a referendum that extends his power until 2036. In Egypt, Dr. Hani Bakr was arrested for a Facebook post criticizing the government for sending medical masks abroad when he didn't have enough in his own practice. Abdel Fattah el-Sisi's government has arrested more than a dozen people for criticizing the official COVID response. In other countries, opportunism. In Poland, President Andrzej Duda pushed through and won a recent election despite EU concerns it wouldn't be safe or fair. The vote was upheld by Duda's hand-picked Supreme Court. In Hong Kong, the pro-Beijing Legislative Council cited COVID to postpone a planned September vote that it was expected to lose. Pro-democracy groups say more than 60 elections have been postponed during COVID, and more than 40 countries have restricted press freedom. These leaders say extraordinary times require extraordinary steps, like border closures, quarantines, and tracking.
Consent for authoritarian rule is often provided with the expectation that authoritarianism is a temporary stage or a sacrifice on the way to building a superior form of state. Temporary authoritarian rule is presented as a necessary stage in the protection of the gains of the revolution, to purge opponents of the revolution, or to reform and modernize the economy. In Stalin's Soviet Union, this was justified in Marxist terms as the dictatorship of the proletariat. In Hitler's Germany, it was the nationalist pride of building a 1,000-year Reich. Now, many social scientists have sought to explain why ordinary people, without having previously engaged in the political process, become attracted to the authoritarian movements of the age. Hannah Arendt, one of the earliest to address this issue, spoke of how alienated and socially isolated individuals are attracted by the masses and their engagement with totalitarianism. Also writing in the 1950s, Theodor Adorno and others applied the techniques of social psychology in an attempt to unearth the personality characteristics of those who might be more susceptible to the appeal of authoritarianism. The book, The Authoritarian Personality, contains the results of social scientific surveys and questionnaires in which people were measured against such character traits as the tendency to value conventional ideas, or to be superstitious or anti-intellectual and therefore prone to authoritarianism. The contemporary rise in authoritarianism has given renewed impetus to studies into authoritarian tendencies.
And when authoritarians feel threatened, they look for strongman leaders.
Leaders who are punitive, who target outgroups, and who have a simple, forceful leadership style that makes them feel strong. And if you were going to grow that candidate in a lab,
I'm gonna bomb the shit out of them.
he would look a lot like Donald Trump.
When you get these terrorists, you have to take out their families. They care about their lives, don't kid yourself. But they say they don't care about their lives. You have to take out their families.
These suggest that a population can have a latent tendency towards authoritarian attitudes, which, given the right triggers, foreign threat, economic insecurity, religious and ethnic minorities, etc., these triggers will result in a significant percentage of the electorate willing to embrace a leader who claims to be able to address those concerns, and of course, to make the country great again. So in conclusion then, over the last few lessons we've identified and explained how structural factors create the conditions in which authoritarianism is more likely to flourish. And today we've identified the types of methods used by authoritarianism to take power. In the next lesson we'll start to look at what happens next. How the authoritarian state that takes power is able to hold on to it and maintain it. More next time.
Architecture of amnesia, scare the people with hysteria. Architecture of amnesia, history lessons disappear.